Thank you so much for joining me today, Megan. It's really exciting to be talking about your practice. We'll be launching, your online exhibition on the 31st of March, which is called Here and Now. So I thought it would be really good today to ask you some questions about yourself and your practice. So if you're happy for me to start, I'd like you first to introduce yourself and your practice and maybe some of the work that you've been making this year.
Okay, hi, thanks for that, Alice. Okay, so my name's Megan Doyle and I make installations and sculptures that deal with the physical aspect of making and the language a material can propagate. So when I'm making, I ask myself a series of questions. So is the material soft or is it hard? Is it malleable? What happens if you mix two materials together that wouldn't usually go together? For example, plaster and fabric. And a phrase I like to use when I'm mixing these two materials together is transformative, where the material sort of undergoes this sort of transformation. And the space where the sculptures are placed also, they're really important to the reading of the work, incredibly so. Yeah. In fact, my work is more about the bones of sculpture. It's object material relationship, the size and scale, the placement, and environment, and also its solidity and fragility. That aspect's also really important.
It feels as though there's a lot of these kind of formal elements that really help you to think about the work that you're making. So nice to hear about that. I guess I was quite interested in this idea of interstitial space that you talk about. So how I understand that, is that like the negative space or the kind of space surrounding those objects? Where did that kind of interest come from for you?
At the time, I was looking at responding to sites, in particular the studio, as a site for making work. So I was sort of exploring the environment around me. So I was quite interested in making the work site specific. So if the work was removed from the space, it wouldn't exist in the same way. Yeah. Like one example of me doing this is using thread and also string, because it was a kind of a temporary intervention, and the objects in the space would inform the work. So the objects that were already in the space, such as tables and chairs, I would sort of incorporate those. Instead of removing them, they would become part of the installation. And also at the time I was looking at the artists Bruce Nauman and also Rachel Whiteread was quite an obvious one for looking at negative and positive spaces. And also Doris Salcedo, she was quite influential to me as well at the time. Yeah,
it's really interesting how it kind of started within that kind of studio space, and I guess it gives you so much possibility and freedom to, every time you make a new work within a new site that is so, specific to the environment, I guess you just don't really know how that's going to play out, and that's something that's quite exciting about your practice. I'm also interested in the kind of documentation process, and obviously some of the works that you're making are really ephemeral and in the moment, and how I'd love to hear about how you document that. And is there a specific way that you have to capture it? Is it durational? Do you just capture it in one moment? If you could tell me a bit more about that.
I think it is within the moment.
Yeah.
Sort of my drawing board, metaphorical drawing board, when I, begin an idea, it always starts in the studio, and actually I'm quite uncomfortable with the idea of beginning projects with research.
Yeah.
I always have to start from zero in the studio with materials, with working with my hands, basically, to start and generate these. They're in a way like thought processes, physical thought processes. But the way I document my work is always through the use of photography. It's never the finished result.
Yeah.
But it's a way to sort of document the sculptures I make.
Yeah.
The
ones
for instance,
that break down over time, and yeah.
Yeah, sure. And with the ice sculptures, that informed part of the installation, I started working with ice and erratic materials. That's where I got the title of this installation from. I started to use video and looking at time and how things shift and change. But then I had issues with how I would present the work to an audience, and my practice has never been about video or photography. It's been more about the physicality of the work. So I sort of sidelined that aspect of my practice and began using more durable materials such as plaster and resin. Of course, resin was the substitute for the ice, which worked for me. I think worked perfectly.
Definitely, you get that like really beautiful transparency that obviously ice and resin both have. It's it's really interesting to hear that you didn't want the work to be viewed as this kind of video or photo outcome. So it's very much about being in the moment, I guess, and that kind of performative element of your work really comes through. I guess this idea of that kind of shift from ice to resin brings me to think about the work that you've made for your MA show. So if you'd like to talk to us a little bit more about what to expect for that.
Well, within my work, I suppose there's an element of not knowing, and I suppose the viewer has to kind of embrace that idea of not knowing what to, well, in a sense, they won't know what to expect, but they have to sort of go on a journey themselves to discover. And with myself, when making work as well, I do find myself treading a narrow sort of tightrope almost all the time, kind of on a knife edge of, will this work, won't this work? And my work definitely does involve an element of risk taking, and of simply, not knowing where this is going to take me. But this does lead my practice down all sorts of paths of inquiry that I've not considered before, and it is like a journey in essence. But essentially, the idea, around erratic instances, this installation was the notion of positive and negative space. I think that idea was the main sort of, the undercurrent, if you like, the main concept. And this idea of mass and volume and weight in sculpture, physical weight, and also the surface and the texture of each piece, and this idea of reflection and embodiment also.
Yeah, and I'm just thinking now about how we've had to translate all of your works to existing online, and that adds a whole new layer now for you, thinking about, you were considering these objects in a physical space, but now they're going to have this reading of a digital space as well. And so I guess, yeah, that brings me to my next question about working, you know, in a pandemic and having to adapt as a student during the pandemic. Obviously, it's meant that there's a whole new reader to your work now that we'll be sharing in our online space. But how have you found generally being a student during the pandemic? Have you had to shift a lot, or have you embraced it? Has it meant that you've been able to work in a new way?
At first, it was very challenging because obviously my practice is very, you know, studio based. I like to be in the studio. I like to make work.
Mm-hmm.
But because of the, you know, restrictions, I wasn't able to be in the studios.
Sure.
But it's had a sort of a positive impact also, because it's challenged me to rethink the way I sort of approach making work,
Mm-hmm.
and made me consider materials that I wouldn't have considered, like water or resin, even the resin aspect, because of its sort of toxic element. I wasn't allowed to use that material in the studio, so I wouldn't have considered using it. But because of making work at home,
Mm-hmm.
I was able to then start using that material.
It's really good to hear that you're able to embrace that, you know, new way of working. And yeah, I think especially because your work is so site specific, it probably just meant that you had to kind of shift, you know, okay, well, where am I working now? You know, what environment am I in? And it's obviously, you know, paid off. You've created this really interesting, beautiful installation that we can't wait to share in our online space, and hopefully one day in a physical space too. My last question for you today, Megan, is what is your best advice for anyone thinking of studying or practicing art? Do you have anything that you'd want to share?
I'd just say, well, trust your instincts, you know, and if that's what you want to do, you know, be confident with your choice and just be open-minded. Be open-minded with the work and where it will lead you, and yeah, go for it.
Yeah, no, that's good advice, and I think a lot of future students would be inspired by that. Oh, thank you so much for your time today, Megan. It's really great to hear more about your work, and over the kind of course of this lead up to your online exhibition, we'll be sharing more images and maybe some of those inspirations as well that you were talking about in terms of other artworks. So yeah, everyone, hopefully you can join us for the launch of Megan's degree show that will be, you know, part of a wider group show as part of the MA at the University of Derby. So we'll be launching that online through Art Core Gallery's website. Thank you again for your time today.